It was in 1979 that the one-child policy was the greatest and last exercise of the Communist Party in social engineering. It was also the reversal of Mao's own policies, in which he quoted from a traditional saying, "Of all things in the world, people are the most precious." It had the remarks of an earnest communist policy. It was a brutal way of streamlining the population and controlling resources. The true title of this policy was the family planning policy, because only normal Han majority families were restricted to single children. For families that were ethnic minorities or had a disabled child or parent, there were special circumstances where they were permitted to have more children. It was also possible that certain families could pay the fines of having another child, and they could beat the system. The other problem was that boys were more important than girls, and not just because they could help out on the farm, but daughters were destined to marry out. The big question was, who would care for her parents and grandparents in the old age? The policymakers in the majority of the provinces did allow couples to have a second child, but the first was a daughter. 1953. Chinese leaders suggest that the population should be controlled and approve a law on contraception and abortion, but the plan is later stranded by political upheaval in the 1959-61 famine. 1970, China's population exceeds 800 million. 1975, China adopts the slogan, "Late, long, and few," encouraging couples to have one child and urging them to have no more than two. 1979, the Communist Party says couples should have no more than one child. A new marriage law says couples are obliged to practice family planning, placing a de facto limit of one child for each family. 1984, China adjusts the policy, allowing a second child for certain families in rural areas and for couples who were both an only child, and in some other specified circumstances. 2001, new laws decreed to better manage the administration of the policy, including penalties for unapproved births. The law allows local government to impose fines for additional children. 2013, China adds an exemption allowing two children for families in which one parent, rather than both, is an only child. 2015, one-child policy scrapped, allowing all couples to have two children for the first time in more than 3 decades. Some of the consequences of the policy was the fertility rate decreased after 1980, the birth rate decreased after 1980, the overall rate of natural increase, the difference between the birth rate and the death rate, declined. As sons were generally preferred over daughters, the overall sex ratio in China became skewed towards males. In 2016, there were 33.59 million more men than women. Because of the preference for sons, there was a rise in the number of abortions of female fetuses. The number of female babies killed, abandoned, or placed in orphanage increased as a result of the policy. Incentives were offered to families complying with the policy, including financial perks and greater employment options. Millions of Chinese parents had to endure strict enforcement methods of the policy, including forced sterilizations and forced abortions. And families that already had one child, the births of additional children in violation of the one-child policy were often undocumented, leading to many problems later on for those children, as they struggled to receive an education or find work. Even after the one-child policy was rescinded, China's birth and fertility rates remained low, leaving the country with a population that was aging too rapidly, as well as a shrinking workforce. Effect it had on women and girls: abortion, contraceptives, and female sterilization. There was birth control, adoption, and contraceptive services for women in the workforce and to protect natal care. In the 1970s, the primary aim of abortions and contraceptives was to control births. It was meant to secure greater control and autonomy over the bodies, and reproductive right. The one-child policy shifted the priorities with a mixed combination of controlling the population growth and the son preference tradition. In 1983, about 20 million babies were born, while more than 14 million fetuses were aborted. Over 16 million females underwent sterilizations, and over 17 million intrauterine device insertions were performed. Skewed sex ratio. One of the most damning implications of the one-child policy has been the skewed sex ratio, which in turn led to a host of other negative consequences. A skewed sex ratio had long existed in China due to the practices of female infanticide and abandonment over son-child preference among parents. However, the ratio had started to drop from the 1930s onwards, but continued to rise again from the 1980s when the policy was implemented. Abandonment, adoption, female infanticide, and missing girls. Due to the prevalent son preference, there is a rise in sex-selective abortions, female infanticide, and abandonment of a girl child. If the girls were not abandoned, they often grew up in fear and were labeled as black children. Oftentimes, the baby girl of the family would be forcibly taken away by birth control officers and sent to orphanages so they could instead be put up for adoption for families out of the country. Thus, the international adoption of Chinese girls came to be one of the most unexpected outcomes of the one-child policy. As many as 150,000 children, most of which were girls, were adopted by families in North America and Europe in the decade and a half after the early 1990s. Missing girls are ones who were not included or went missing from the birth registers. They often did not survive, either due to perinatal neglect and discrimination, or the prevalent notion that the upkeep of daughters is an unnecessary expense and waste. Policy officially ended on January 1, 2016. China signed a bill allowing married couples to have a second child. This was to cope with shrinking workforce and aging population. In 2017, President Xi Jinping also dropped the unusual reference to family planning, saying China would promote the coordination of childbirth policies with other economic and social policies. It was the first time in nearly 30 years that the party work did not contain a reference to birth control. China's 2020 census states that mothers gave birth to about 12 million babies compared to 2019's 14.65 million. Beijing announced at the end of 2021 that it would allow each couple to have 3 children.